Benvenuti, siete sul sentiero sottile. Ci sono percorsi accademici che nascono sui libri, ci sono percorsi accademici invece che nascono dalla storia, dentro la storia. Oggi abbiamo il piacere e l'onore di ospitare il professor Sophal Ear, uno dei più autorevoli studiosi nel campo della political economy internazionale, con un focus preciso e orientato verso il sud-est asiatico e alle dinamiche di sviluppo e di governance e di influenza globale. Il professor Ear è associated professor presso la Thunderbird School Global Management dell'Arizona State University, che è un'istituzione di riferimento per gli studi sul management globale e per le relazioni economiche internazionali. La ricerca del professore si concentra sull'impatto degli aiuti allo sviluppo e degli investimenti esteri e ancora delle relazioni asimmetriche fra gli stati, con particolare attenzione alla Cambogia e alla regione Indo-Pacifica. Il professore Ear è autore del volume Dependence in Cambodia, How Foreign Assistance Undermines Democracy, un contributo rilevante al dibattito internazionale proprio sui limiti strutturali degli aiuti e sulle implicazioni politiche della dipendenza economica. Nel corso della sua carriera, il professore ha collaborato con istituzioni di primo piano, come la World Bank, contribuendo all'analisi delle politiche di sviluppo e delle loro conseguenze concrete. La prospettiva del professore Ear unisce quindi rigore accademico e esperienza diretta, offrendo una lettura particolarmente lucida delle trasformazioni in atto nell'Indo-Pacifico. A condurre questa intervista sarà un nostro collaboratore prezioso, Elia Giovanni. Ebbene, quindi questo dialogo si inserisce quindi in un percorso più ampio di interviste dal respiro internazionale, volto a mettere in relazione pensiero accademico, scenari strategici e nuove prospettive. Welcome, Professor Sophal Ear. Thank you again for being with us.
Thank you.
Thank you. At this point, I hand over to Elia Giovanni, who will lead the interview. Forward to the conversation, Elia.
Yes, perfect. Let's get started with the first question. The first question, Professor, is about the Chinese development model. Strong state control, massive infrastructure investments, rapid growth is often presented as an alternative to the Western model, which relies more on markets and democratic institutions. But is this really something other countries can replicate? When we look at cases like Ethiopia or Laos, which have tried to follow a similar path with mixed results, are we looking at a truly exportable model or at something deeply unique to China's scale, history, and political structure?
All right. Well, thank you, Luca, and thank you, Elia, for this. What I think, or what we call the quote unquote Chinese model, is really less a blueprint than a bundle of conditions that are very hard to replicate. China's rise combined centralized political control with decentralized experimentation at the provincial level. Think of Shenzhen, think of Shanghai. These were kind of charter cities that were given the freedom to develop economically, not politically, but economically.
Yes.
And combined with very high domestic savings rates, often above 40% of GDP. Hence why Paul Krugman, for example, argued years ago that the Asian miracle was not truly an Asian miracle because he compared it to like a sausage factory. If you put in more inputs, as in the 40% of GDP savings, then you will get more outputs in terms of investments and so on. But the productivity isn't going up. It's simply that you put in more, you get out more, and you've got on top of that in China a market of 1.4 billion people.
Yes, of
So
course.
those structural features matter more than the visible elements like infrastructure spending. Ethiopia and Laos don't have anything like, those numbers of in the population. When countries such as Ethiopia or Laos try to emulate the Chinese model, they tend to replicate the visible parts, especially the state-led investment financed by external borrowing. I was teaching this weekend in Washington, D.C., and one of the students is an expert in, he's a mid-career student, expert in airlines. And he said that Ethiopia Air, for example, is very successful in terms of one of the leading airlines in Africa, but it's also apparently, allegedly, run by the Ethiopian military, for example. On the other hand, Laos has seen public and publicly guaranteed debt climb to roughly 100% of GDP, much of it tied to large infrastructure projects. For example, projects like railroads that China is building. And as a result, China has now taken control of Électricité du Laos, which is the main electrical power system grid of the country itself, to guarantee that it will receive money back for all of the loans it has made in other parts of Laos's economy. Ethiopia achieved rapid growth for years, often above 8% annually, but ran into foreign exchange constraints and debt pressures that exposed the limits of that approach. So the issue is not whether the model itself is attractive. Of course, it's attractive to countries that think of rapid economic development. And I argue this in my international political economy courses. It's simply not possible for countries that develop later to simply rely on the market alone. It has to be the state getting involved in some ways, but whether it stays involved or creates the conditions for investment and so on, and then allows for competition to take place is the key. Here, what you see is the question is whether this Chinese model travels well. And in most cases, what travels is the risk, the debt accumulation, the governance strain, and the implementation gaps. What does not travel easily is China's administrative capacity, its scale, or its ability to sequence reforms over decades. Now, one of the fascinating things is that, people talk about how China can change in terms of its approach to things from cultural revolution to the great leap forward cultural revolution to suddenly market opening and so on, and that's seen as a positive. And of course it's good when they make the right choices and open things up, but when they make the wrong choices you can end up with millions dying of starvation, with furnaces in the backyards that are trying to make iron production and can't make quality works because you need much more than backyard furnaces for iron production. And so that's what I worry about is only selecting the cases of success and saying that's the Chinese model, but forgetting that China has had a long record of failure as well, along with obviously spreading its model to places like Cambodia in the past, where instead of having economic growth, we had genocide and mass atrocity crimes, and 25% of the population dying, including, as you alluded to, my personal history, my own father and my brother missing, and so on. So this is not this has consequences, but right now they're in a positive phase of seeming invincibility, which has not always been the case historically.
Prima di continuare, chiediamo a chi ci segue un piccolo gesto. È semplice, ma per noi è estremamente importante. Iscriversi al canale. È un gesto gratuito, ma che ci permette concretamente di continuare questo percorso e di sostenere il lavoro necessario per organizzare gli incontri, i dialoghi e gli appuntamenti con ospiti internazionali di così alto profilo. Portare avanti questi confronti richiede tempo, dedizione e un impegno costante. Il vostro sostegno fa realmente la differenza. Grazie.
Yes, of course. Thank you. The second question is that some countries experience rapid economic growth while operating with relatively weak or fragile institutions. Like what you said, if you took cases like Myanmar before the recent crisis, growth was real, but so were governance challenges, obviously. Can this model hold over time, or does it inevitably run into structural limits such as corruption, instability, or economic slowdown? You already said a part of these, obviously.
Yes, I did. And look, it can hold for a time, but it carries built-in limits. Cambodia is
Yes.
a good example, as I alluded to. For nearly 2 decades, the country averaged growth rates close to 7%, driven by garments, construction, tourism, and later real estate. Poverty rates fell sharply from roughly half the population in the early 2000s to under 20% by the late 2010s. Of course, nowadays, Cambodia is being called out for the scam compounds in the country and is even been nicknamed or whispered about as Cambodia, which I mean, obviously is a tragedy because, you know, Cambodia had this genocide. So it used to be called Kampuchea at one point. Now it's back to its name Cambodia, and now people are calling it Scambodia, and this is terrible. They're even talking about changing the name because it's too close to the word scam. But that growth model was narrow and vulnerable. It depended heavily on preferential access to to Western markets, foreign direct investment by ethnic Chinese concentrated in a few sectors like garments, and a governance system that struggled with regulatory consistency and the weight of corruption. When when these shocks hit, whether the partial withdrawal of the EU trade preferences under everything but arms, for example, when human rights abuses and
Yes.
democratic backsliding took place, or the collapse of tourism during COVID, for example, after 2020, the fragility became visible. When you put all your eggs in one basket of, garments or tourism or real estate speculation, and something happens to it, well, it can collapse easily, including, for example, the scam activity. I don't think any country should specialize in that. But at one point, we were talking about numbers like 40% of GDP is driven by scam. To give you a concrete example, the guy that that the US Department of Justice recently sanctioned in October and is now arrested in China, Chen Zi, had confiscated from him $15 billion worth of Bitcoin at the time. Of course, Bitcoin has gone down in value, so it's not 15 billion these days, but 15 billion is actually $3 billion more than the debt of Cambodia. This one man had 15 billion in Bitcoin. So, and that's from the scam activities of his one enterprise. Myanmar's trajectory was even more stark. After liberalization in the 2010s, growth accelerated, as you well know, but institutional foundations remained weak. The
Yes.
2021 military coup did not just disrupt growth, it reversed it entirely, with GDP contracting sharply and investment collapsing. And instead of hearing about, democracy and opening up of Myanmar, we've instead read about fighter jets bombing concerts full of civilians. This is crazy. So the lesson is not that growth without strong institutions is impossible. That we know happens. It is that it is difficult to sustain and even harder to make inclusive. Over time, the constraints show up in misallocation, in elite capture of state institutions, and in terms of vulnerability to shocks. So I think the lesson here is that yes, some countries do experience a rapid economic growth while operating in a relatively weak or fragile institutional environment. But this cannot continue indefinitely. You enter situations where you just run out of runway, and the consequences of hosting a scam economy become impossible to deny. Uh, Perhaps a Korean young man is killed, as happened in actuality, and then the Korean government says, enough of this. You took one of our young college students and killed him. Or others get tired of Cambodia's reputation as a place where it just can't operate this way much longer. And now it's finally, I think, dealing with it, but I don't know that it's 100% truly committed to that. The people who have exited the scam centers are now entering other scam centers that have been set up. And if you look at the arrests, nobody of really significant power has been arrested. It's always some small fry, some minor tycoons. It's not really dealing with the true root of the problem. It's still superficial and on the surface.
Yes, of course. Thank you. The third question, yes. Four question. Professor, when smaller economies receive large-scale investments from major powers, there is often a concern about losing control over key assets or decisions. The case of Sri Lanka, Abandoda port, is frequently cited as a warning example. Do you see this as an isolated situation or as a part of a broader pattern that could also affect Southeast Asia, for example? And what tools do countries actually have to preserve their autonomy?
Right. Well, I do talk about Hambantota in my presentations, and it is often uh, simplified or boiled down to as a debt trap. But the reality is more complex. Sri Lanka's external debt distress had multiple causes, including international sovereign bonds and domestic fiscal issues. The port leased to a Chinese company for 99 years was a political and financial decision made under pressure. We all
Mm.
know that. I mean, you know, if you can't pay your debt and it's turned into equity, well, these things are not happening in a vacuum. Beijing is probably looking at the value of the port in other ways, and not it was not an inevitable outcome of Chinese lending alone. It wasn't like this is the master plan and we're truly actually interested in acquiring this port. It did result in that at the end, but it's also possible that it was not premeditated. That said, the broader concern is real. Smaller
Okay.
economies that rely heavily on external financing, especially for large capital intensive projects, can find themselves with limited bargaining power if projects underperform, as happened with Hambantona and with an airport that was also built in Sri Lanka in a part of the country that was the former president's province, and therefore clearly a political project for him to get votes, but turned out to be one of the least used airports in the world. In parts of Southeast Asia, we see a similar dynamic, though not identical outcomes. The key variable, I mean, look, if you look at Malaysia, for example, across from Singapore, there's this forest city that was built by Chinese investment. And you can go on YouTube and watch videos of people sort of visiting Forest City, and it's like empty, like there's
Yes.
nobody living there. Why did they do this? Was it because they want to take this city later to no, no. I think it's simply that not all the investments that the Chinese businesses make and companies make are smart. They may, in fact, make mistakes in the projection of whether this will make revenue in the future and pay for itself. I don't know. I mean, if you said, oh, now we're going to turn it into a military base, of course we would say, we'd have to conclude that there was something more nefarious behind it, but it's not. It's simply an overbuilt place that like many others ended up being a ghost city. The key
Yeah.
variable is not the source of financing, but domestic governance capacity. Countries that conduct rigorous project appraisal, maintain transparent procurement processes, and diversify their financing sources retain more autonomy. Those that do not are more exposed, regardless of whether the partner is China, the United States, or anyone else. So, during the Asian financial crisis, there was a city like Forest City in Malaysia, but in Thailand. But nobody said that, oh, it's the evil banks that are trying to,
Yes.
no, it was just they financed it. They totally miscalculated the demand, or they thought, oh, it's not, there's no foreign exchange risk. Well, guess what? When the Thai baht was devalued, they lost their shirts, and then they had to get a haircut because, in financial terms, less money back from the loan because it was clear that they made a terrible mistake financially. Their projections were wrong. But who has ever seen economists and finance people never make mistakes? You have the 97 Asian financial crisis, you have 2008, 9 global financial crisis. I mean, you've got everywhere the possibility of even the IMF not seeing the problem before it happens, right? Later, belatedly, then realizing, oh my God, why didn't we see this? Yeah, they're great, great, great at everything, but apparently seeing what's about to happen very quickly in front of them. That's, of course, the illusion of economics being like this incredible scientific field that is very quantitative and able to predict things. But in fact, it's not able to predict the biggest things that happen because it didn't see them coming.
Yes, there's a lot of mitigation about that, probably.
Yes.
Yes, thank you. And fifth question is, Professor, Europe is trying to reassert its presence in Southeast Asia through trade agreements and investment initiatives, but in a region increasingly shaped by USA China competition. Does Europe have real strategic leverage, or is it still perceiving mainly as an economic partner rather than a geopolitical actor?
Well, you've asked an important question. Europe's strength in Southeast Asia is economic and regulatory rather than geopolitical in the traditional sense. The European Union is one of the region's largest sources of foreign direct investment, with stocks in the hundreds of billions of euros. And it plays a major role in trade through agreements like the EU-Vietnam Free Trade Agreement. Where Europe has distinct leverage is in standards, whether it's data protection, GDPR, or environmental rules, or supply chain due diligence. European regulations often shape global practices because firms that want access to European markets have to comply. This is sometimes described as the Brussels effect. Europe is not a security actor in the region in the same way the
Yes,
United States is. It does
yes, of
not
course.
have China's scale of financing. So it's seen primarily as a high quality economic partner and a source of rules and standards rather than a central player in hard geopolitics. And I think that role is an important one. It's critical, especially now that the United States under Trump doesn't seem to care about standards, only wants transactional deals where let's just make a deal, this and that, or you'll get beaten on the head with tariffs. this is not Europe's approach, and it's thank goodness it's not Europe's approach.
Yes.
Europe has a more, forward-thinking, relationship-based approach that is partnering and with the regulatory framework, helping, I think, to make Southeast Asia more of a place that has better standards, less abuses of workers, and will help the region develop more soundly over time than one in which a partner simply says, we don't care how you made this, how many children worked on it, or whatnot, or what chemicals were used to produce this good that is exported to Europe. Of course, they care about it, and of course, that increases the standard of production and labor and environmental respect in Southeast Asia.
Yes, I think Europe is also very divided if we confront it with USA, for example. Southeast Asian countries seem to walk a fine line between the United States and China. Take Vietnam, for example, strengthening security ties with Washington while remaining deeply economically connected to Beijing. Is this balancing act sustainable over time, or are we witnessing a temporary phase that will eventually force clearer strategic choices?
Right. Well, the balancing strategy that you're talking about is not a temporary phase. It is the strategy. Southeast Asian states are not indecisive. They're optimizing under constraint. So take Vietnam. China is its largest trading partner, accounting for roughly a third of imports, especially intermediate goods that feed into Vietnam's export machine. At the same time, the United States is its largest export market, absorbing a significant share of manufactured goods. So economically, Vietnam is structurally tied to both China and the United States. On the security side, concerns about the South China Sea push Vietnam closer to Washington, D.C., but without formal alliances. The result is that we might call asymmetric hedging, deep economic interdependence with China combined with selective security cooperation with the United States. Why do you think Vietnam is doing a Trump hotel, uh, you know, uh, project? This is to curry favor with Trump. This is sustainable as long as the cost of choosing exceed the benefits. The real risk is not that countries will be forced to choose in a formal sense, but that technological decoupling, supply chain fragmentation, or financial sanctions begin to narrow their room to maneuver. So, in other words, the strategy is one that makes sense for countries in a region that does not want to say, I'm with country X 100%, because that would mean that they would then be with country Y 0%. And the smarter way of approaching it is to take an approach where, in the case of Vietnam, the economy depends on China. They might hate China because China was used to dominate over them and is trying to take control of the South China Sea and so on. But they cannot simply say, we don't want to do business with China. How can they? They're neighbors.
Yeah.
They're next to each other. And China is too big of an economy to be ignoring this way. But they're not going to say, oh, in China, we're going to host your military like Cambodia is doing, or we're going to have military exercises every year with China, and we're going to get deeper and deeper with you and engage with you. A lot of this has to do with the fact that, the former head of state of Cambodia, Prince Sihanouk, would say it's easier to have a closer relationship with countries that you don't share a border with, because the countries that you share a border with, they can just cross it and
Yes.
invade you. Instead, be friends with a country that doesn't have a border with you. Hence, Cambodia's relationship with China. It doesn't share a border with China. Cambodia and China don't share a border. But Vietnam and China share borders, and Vietnam and Cambodia share borders. But at least from that standpoint, yes, okay, you can be friends with China, very close friends with China. You can be even great friends with the United States. But in the case of Vietnam, for example, you cannot be too close to China because, after all, they have a reason for trying to possibly invade. I mean, it's an old-fashioned view. Like, you, you know, airplanes can bring people in all the time. But I suppose it's more difficult if an entire nation is invaded by air. That would just mean that you brought in the tourists and allowed them to take control over your country, which I think in some ways over tourism has done for some countries.
It's surely better trying to be friends with all everything. I mean,
Exactly.
the last question is looking ahead to the next decade, what will truly shape the future of Southeast Asia? For instance, countries like Indonesia and the Philippines are experiencing a strong demographic and urban growth. Could this become a major competitive advantage, or without strong institution and infrastructure, does it risk turning into a source of fragility instead?
Well, demography can be an asset, but it is not destiny. Indonesia and the Philippines both have young populations with median ages around 30 or below, growing urban centers. In principle, that creates a demographic dividend, a large working population that can drive growth. But the dividend only materializes if jobs are created. What if you have all these young people and instead AI has taken all the jobs and they're not getting the ability to enter the
Yes,
labor force?
that's a terrible perspective for me.
Exactly. So skills are developed. So what you have to do then is you have to develop those skills. You have to keep infrastructure at a good pace. Otherwise, the same dynamics can produce urban congestion, underemployment, and social strain. The World Bank has long emphasized that the window for capturing a demographic dividend is limited. If missed, it can turn into a demographic burden. So the future of Southeast Asia will be shaped less by raw demographics and more by policy choices, education quality, urban planning, digital infrastructure, and governance capacity. Countries that align these elements can sustain growth and move up the value chains. Those that do not may grow, but unevenly and with greater volatility. And then at the end, face the consequences of a demographic cliff or an aging population, because all those young people will eventually grow old. And if you have obviously the problems of Japan, of China, with too many old people and not enough young people, or of Korea, South Korea, same problem. All of these countries that developed and had high population growth and then eventually felt that or faced the consequences of an aging population, then you get, I think, a worse situation at the end because you have to either bring in immigration to help with your economy, or you have to get the robots, I guess. And
Yes.
Japan is trying that approach because it hates immigration. But the fact is that its old people will be aging in a country where there aren't enough people. And that is like erasing yourself as a country when you don't have people to continue to run the country, to give it vitality. And so, if you go on YouTube, you see all these videos of non-Japanese people going to Japan to take some real estate. And also, as you know, in Italy, €1, you can
Yeah.
have a house, etc. Good luck, good luck. I mean, it's like you have to bring in more people in order to get those places revitalized and feeling like, you know families can have children there, and there can be a community, not simply deserted rural areas as a result. Anyhow,
Yes, of
so
course. Thank you.
that's my thought.
Thank you. Really, really thank you. I also wanted to say to you that about your criticism of independence, that
Yeah.
reminded me a lot of what Thomas Sankara said about
Ah,
Burkina Faso. They said basically the same thing as you.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I
You
I'm
take
I'm
the
glad.
inspiration, maybe.
Yes, yes. I mean, look, aid dependence, of course, what's sad is that while I criticize foreign aid as causing problems, my point was not that all foreign aid is terrible and should never be used.
Yes,
It's
yes,
simply
yes.
that, there's certain levels of foreign aid when it's too much and causes countries to uh, listen to the donors instead of listening to their own citizens that
Of course.
we should not have. Uh, but I never imagined that the consequences of listening to, oh, criticism, foreign aid equals USAID should just stop working and let's just fire everybody and stop all the investment we made for decades would make any sense at all. Of course, it doesn't make sense to take that approach. It makes sense to look at foreign aid and to see what works, what doesn't work, and why, and improve the things that work or change the things that don't work so that they can work, so that you can make, you know, improvements and have
Yes,
more effective foreign aid, not no foreign aid. That is an approach that I think is short-sighted, terribly lacking in empathy, and does not seem to understand that you will create more problems down the road
yes,
when, the next Afghanistan happens, or when the next, when there's more migration as a result of poverty increasing. We're now only seeing a little bit of, like, people are looking at the aid cuts and thinking, oh, this will be look, everything is fine in Africa, it's okay, but we already know that in Zambia, the percentage of HIV AIDS is increasing. This is not a good situation. It will only lead to more problems and more suffering, which then, we think about it as like, oh, this won't affect us. No, of course it will affect. It will affect Europe. So what America does by cutting foreign aid affects Africa, which then will affect Europe. And then, America can yeah, not allow anyone in. Well, that's not a solution. I mean, it's not a
yes.
long-term solution, and it's certainly short-sighted, as we all recognize.
Yes, I think exactly the same is the problem that is not a long solution, a long time solution. Really, really thank you. It was
well,
really a pleasure listening to you and
Absolutely.
hearing your talks about the questions, about these arguments. I personally really hope we'll talk again in the future, maybe.
Absolutely. I mean, I've been to Italy several times, and I promised my kids that they must get a trip to Italy, and so I'm looking for an excuse
Okay.
thank you very much, Professor, for
Of
your
course.
time and for the depth of your insights.
Thank
Um,
you. My pleasure. All right.